The New England Patriots are 3-11, which is kind of to be expected for a rebuilding team. With that all said though, this team has had a lot of ups and downs this year, so in today's video, I want to talk about the New England Patriots, what have been their problems, and what they can do in the future to fix some of their issues. But if you guys do go on to enjoy the video, make sure you guys hit the like and subscribe button. Let's just hop right into it. I think the best way to start this video off is just by briefly covering some statistics to kind of just set the groundwork for everything we're going to talk about in this video. On the offensive side of things, they're averaging only 17 points per game, which ranks them number 31 in the NFL. They're also only averaging 292.5 yards per game, which ranks them number 30, and they're only averaging 1.7 touchdowns per game, which ranks them number 30 as well. I think we also do have to take into context that for around half the season, Jacoby Brissett was the starting quarterback for this team, which obviously has kind of brought down the numbers a tad bit, though I will say the offense hasn't been spectacular under Drake May, but I will say it's been a little bit better. Defensively, the team is slightly better on the defensive side of things, though it's definitely been very disappointing given what our expectations were for this defense coming into the year. On defense, they are giving up 24.1 points per game, which ranks them number 23. They're giving up 344.1 yards per game, and they're giving up 2.7 touchdowns per game, which puts them number 24 in the NFL. Again, I would say the defense has been somewhat disappointing this year, given the fact that coming into this year, they had a legitimate argument to maybe be a top 10 defense, but they just haven't lived up to that hype. They've been kind of middle of the pack, bordering on just not being very good. So what's been the issues? Well, I think there's a couple things. We'll start off with the offensive side of things and kind of just go through there. For starters, on offense, this team doesn't have a consistent ground game. As of right now, they rank 10th in yards per rush, but they only run the ball on 43% of plays. They're not necessarily bad at rushing the football, but it's just been up and down. Some weeks Ramondre Stevenson is really good, and some weeks he's just non-existent. I also think the offensive line has been a massive issue the entire season. Their quarterback sack rate is 28th worst in the NFL with a 9.3% sack rate. Now, I do want to say some of those issues are on the quarterback for not escaping the pocket properly or not navigating the pocket properly, but I would say most of the blame, if not all of the blame, should go on the offensive line because it has not been good. Offensively speaking, this team is limited personnel-wise, both in the receiving core and in the offensive line, so to expect this offense to be good is a really weird thing to be disappointed by, because this offense was never going to be good given the fact that they just don't have the personnel to sustain a young developing quarterback. I also do think that there needs to be some blame pointed to the coaching staff for not putting together great enough game plans and kind of always looking like they're getting out-coached most games. I'm not necessarily saying you fire your head coach or you fire your defensive coordinator or anything like that, but I at least think that there should be some conversations about whether or not they should keep the guys they have or potentially move on to look for a better name. Right now, guys like Mike Vrabel and Ben Johnson, I would easily take over Gerard Mayo in a heartbeat, but I don't know if either of those guys would come to a rebuilding New England team. On the defensive side of things, as I mentioned earlier, it's better than the offense, but it hasn't been particularly good. For starters, this team just doesn't have a consistent pass rusher on the field right now. Sure, you have guys like Yannick Ngakoue, Keon White, who's actually having a pretty good year, Christian Barmore, and a couple other guys, but this team just doesn't have like a 10 sack a season type of guy. This could be a team that could really use like I don't want to say a Micah Parsons or a Nick Bosa or somebody like that, but somebody on those lines. So maybe in the draft we can look to approach and try to get that, or maybe through free agency. And kind of similar to the offense, the defense is just right now lacking in personnel. They have a couple nice pieces here and there, but given the fact that the past few drafts have not been very good for the Patriots, they've had guys like Kyle Duggar starting for them, Cole Strange on the offensive line starting for them. These are just first round picks that just haven't really hit, though I'll say Kyle Duggar has been okay. So all in all, this is a team with limited personnel. There's a couple good players here and there. I think guys like Drake May, Mike Onwenu, Keon White, and Christian Gonzalez are like your mainstay guys. Obviously, we'll have to wait and see what happens with Jabril Peppers because there's some off the field issues going on. So that could potentially kind of throw a wrench in things for the Patriots if they want to keep him or not, given the outcome of his off the field legal issues. So that kind of takes me into what's going to happen next for the team. Obviously, we talked about all their issues from this year, but what comes next? Well, for starters, assets-wise, they have around $132 million in 2025 to go along with 9 draft picks. So this team has plenty of assets moving forward to try and fix up and add some pieces to this roster. And it isn't like this team has a whole bunch of players they have to pay. They have guys like Jonathan Jones, Jacoby Brissett, Okafor, and Joey Sly, and a couple other guys as well. But I don't think you really need to bring back most most of those guys. Maybe you want to bring back some of them for depth, but I don't think you got to bring back a ton of them. The only one I would really consider bringing back would be like Jacoby Brissett, because he's a good backup at least. So in terms of your assets, those are your assets. In terms of who you're bringing back, I don't think you're bringing back anybody. And even if you were to bring back a couple of those guys, it wouldn't cost you that much, maybe like 10 to 15 million to bring back some of those names. Hey guys, sorry to interrupt. I'll be really quick. I did start a brand new YouTube channel called Metro Stories. I think you guys might like it. It's a channel that we simply focus on stories of NFL players as well as NFL teams. So if you guys are interested in that, go ahead and look in the description below as well as on the pinned comment where you're going to find a link for that channel. But let's get back to the video. There's also the potential of David Andrews retiring, so that could also save and potentially hurt your cap space a tad bit as well as you can restructure deals like Christian Barmore and Mike Onwenu if you want to open up a bit more cap space, but you already have $132 million to work with, so I don't really feel like you have to do too much. Going on those lines a little bit more, if you do want to cut some players, there really isn't a whole lot of options out there, though I do think one name that could potentially be cut to save you a little bit of money would be Kendrick Bourne, though I don't know if you would because he is a good receiver, so maybe you just want to keep him instead of cutting him. So that's kind of everything to kind of think about as we go forward into free agency and the draft. They have a ton of money, a lot of draft picks, but a lot of issues to fix. So let's kind of go into it. What are the positions that have to be addressed? Well, on the offensive end, I think receiver, maybe even tight end and offensive line are the three most important positions. Obviously, if you can find an upgrade in the running back room, maybe you would take it, but I just don't think you should prioritize that this year. And on the defensive side of things, I think you need an edge rusher, potentially a cornerback too alongside Christian Gonzalez. And because there's some questions about Jabril Peppers, I think you also need a safety. So I'm not going to necessarily say like which players this team should specifically target. Later in the offseason, I'll do a dedicated video where I do essentially a mock rebuild for this team. So for now, I'm just going to be listing out some potential names to think about, and then later in the offseason, come back and we'll have a more legitimate rebuild for this team. So when it comes to wide receiver, this team again has a ton of money, so I'm looking at some big free agent options. Obviously, T. Higgins is like the dream for this team, but there's some other guys out there like Chris Godwin and Keenan Allen. I'm looking for somebody who's just going to be reliable and consistent, kind of like Adam Thielen for Bryce Young. I feel like that's what Chris Godwin and Keenan Allen could be for Drake May. I also do think this team should be looking in the draft for a receiver as well. So even if they took one of those three receivers, I still think drafting a wide receiver in the rounds 1, 2, or 3 would still be in play. In terms of offensive linemen, again, I'm going for big name guys. This team has to look to address the offensive line because, yes, you have Mike Onwenu, who is extremely versatile, but you got to figure out the rest of the offensive line too. Some names I like are guys like Garrett Bowles, Morgan Moses, Ryan Kelly, Kevin Zeitler, and Dan Moore Jr. A lot of these guys are older veterans who you just know are going to work out for your team. I need guys who can come in and instantly make an impact. I don't want guys who I have to develop or I have to take a risk on. All of these guys are surefire hits and will work for this team for at least a few years. The same thing could also be said about the edge rushing room. I feel like you have a couple upside guys already on the team. You just really need just a dominant edge rushing presence. And I think guys like Josh Sweat, Khalil Mack, and DeMarcus Lawrence are all guys who I know I can trust and rely upon to get me close to 10 sacks a season. I would want these guys on my team. Those picks also wouldn't stop me from drafting a potential like Abdul Carter or a Shamar Stewart later in the draft. In terms of corner, I need somebody who can play alongside Christian Gonzalez. So some names I did come up with. Some of these I don't think are terribly realistic, but I at least wanted to present the names to you guys. Are guys like DJ Reed, Rasul Douglas, Carlton Davis, and Paulson Adebo. Of those names, I actually think Adebo might be my favorite fit for this team. Put him alongside Christian Gonzalez. I think that could be a really nice cornerback duo. And then with safety, again, there's some question marks with both Kyle Duggar and Jabril Peppers. Obviously, Peppers a bit more extreme, but there's questions about both those positions. So I went with guys like Budda Baker, who I don't think will leave Arizona, but you never know. Justin Reed from Kansas City, Justin Simmons, who's playing okay right now, and Jeremy Chin as sort of a cheaper alternative who can just kind of be a decent player for you. So those are some potential targets. Again, this team has a ton of money, so they can really look at like the premier options at each of their positional needs. This team doesn't necessarily have to go for like older veterans who are just kind of looking for cheap contracts to kind of play on. This team can kind of swing for the fences and take as many big name guys as they can because they don't have a bunch of money to spend and they have a bunch of money to go. So that's what I would do in free agency. I think this team kind of has to be somewhat aggressive in free agency. Do I think that they should spend all their money? Obviously Obviously not, but if this team could spend, I don't know, 70, 80 million or so in free agency, I don't think they would necessarily say no to it, especially given the fact that Drake May is on a rookie contract. Now, as we look towards the draft, this team does have a number of picks, but I'm only going to look at some rounds 1 through 3 targets. I think 4th, 5th, 6th rounds, it kind of becomes a little bit random, and I haven't done that much research into this draft class. So for now, I'm only going to look at guys who I have already done some research on, and that's going to be rounds 1 through 3. For rounds 1, this team is likely going to end with a top 5 pick, so you're looking at like the premier of premierist targets. Travis Hunter is obviously the cream of the crop. He's probably the best overall player in this draft. I don't know if he's going to fall to New England, but if he were to do so, it could be pretty interesting because he can play both corner and receiver. I still would prefer some other names over Travis Hunter because this team doesn't necessarily need a corner, but if they want to go BPA, I think Travis Hunter would be a fine option. Outside of Hunter, Ted McMillan from Arizona, I think is the best pure wide receiver prospect in this draft. Massive size, isn't necessarily the greatest separator, but doesn't really have to because of how big he is and how good his catch radius is. He's a really good wide receiver one who I think would be a really good fit with Drake May. If you want to go an edge rusher, I think Abdul Carter is the clear cut, really the only edge rusher I would take in the top 5. And then if you want to go offensive line, I like Kelvin Banks personally. I think he's the best tackle prospect. When it comes to round 2, there's a lot of different names out there, but I like guys like Landon Jackson, the edge rusher from Arkansas, Jahdae Barron, the corner from Texas. I don't know if he'll be there in the 2nd round, but if he is, he'd be a home run nickel, outside corner, or even safety for this team. Gray Zabel from North Dakota State could be an interior or exterior offensive line, wherever you really want to put him. Ashton Gillette from Louisville is a productive edge rusher who I think could be a good player. There's also some other guys like, I hope I don't mispronounce this, but I probably will, a wide receiver from Stanford, Alec Ayamanor. I apologize, I just never know how to say his name. And kind of on those same lines, I don't know how to say this guy's last name, but Jonah Savainea from Arizona. He's a tackle prospect who I think could potentially be a late 1st rounder. All those guys make a ton of sense. They fill in positions of need, and they're really good players. Now, when it comes to 3rd round, there's also a bunch of names out there. Guys like Tyler Booker, the interior offensive lineman from Alabama, would make a bunch of sense for this team as well, especially if a guy like David Andrews were to retire, especially. Kevin Winston, the safety, Jalen Royals, the wide receiver, Eli Stowers, a tight end, who I think is a really solid player. Maybe not necessarily a massive need because you do have Hunter Henry, but Hunter is not necessarily fantastic and is only getting older, so getting a guy like an Eli Stowers could be interesting. Then, of course, you have Nick, and I'm going to mispronounce this last name again, Iman Wari, who is a safety from South Carolina. I think he's a fantastic player, has been awesome in college. I wonder if his game will translate fully to the NFL level, but given the fact that I think safety is a bit of a need for this team, I'd be willing to take a bit of a risk on him. I also like Blake Miller, the tackle from Clemson. I think he can be a good player, as well as Sebastian Castro could also be an interesting name as well. All of those guys are options for positions of need. Again, when we get to the offseason, I'll do like legitimate mock drafts for this team, and I'll do legitimate rebuilding mocks. So if you want more like a legitimate version of this, we will do this a lot later. Right now, I just kind of want to talk about the issues, their assets, and guys that they could look to target in free agency and the draft. So hopefully you guys took a little bit of something from this video. I don't think this team is terribly far from being very good. As long as you have a quarterback like Drake May, who I think is a special talent, you're going to be fine. It's just going to take a little bit of some time to actually add the pieces to your team, get them acclimated to your system, and actually becoming a functioning roster. So for now, we'll have to wait and see how this team does. But if you enjoyed the video, make sure you guys hit the like and subscribe button, and I love you guys. Peace.